We are getting closer and closer to the federal elections in Australia, and you are now reminded of a specific feature of the Australian legal system. You must vote. You have the obligation, the duty, not only the liberty to vote. That's right, voting in Australia is mandatory. Hello everyone, my name is Renato Costa, this is AUSSIE Law, and today we will talk about compulsory voting in Australia. Compulsory voting only exists because, first, Australia legislated about compulsory enrolment. You see, you're only able to vote because, first, you have been enrolled. You are part of an electoral roll. And this has been the rule since 1911, when Australia first legislated about compulsory enrolment. And it was this idea of making something that people consider to be a liberty mandatory that led to the imposition of an obligation to vote in Australia. The first state to make voting mandatory in Australia was Queensland in 1915. The Commonwealth established compulsory voting in Australia in 1924 and was followed by Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales, Western Australia and South Australia. The first federal election after voting became compulsory was on November 14, 1925, and the turnout for their election was higher than 91%. That represented an increase of more than 32% on the previous election. And this is generally the reason why countries adopt compulsory voting. That's because it has proven to be the best way to guarantee higher turnout rates. And some argue that having more turnout equals to more legitimacy in an election because more electors are participating. There are around 20 countries in the world that have made voting compulsory. Now, most of them are in Central or in South America, but we can find the same rule in other parts of the globe as well, like in Greece, Singapore or Belgium. Australia is the only English-speaking democracy that compels its citizens to vote. But at least there are some benefits to it, and we can see them in Australia. For example, before compulsory voting in Australia, in the federal elections of 1919, the turnout was of around 71%. And in the elections of 1922, the turnout was around 60%. Now, as I said before, in the federal elections of 1925, turnout was higher than 91%. And no Australian election has had a lower turnout than 91% since the introduction of compulsory voting in 1924. Professor Moore has even said that usually turnout in federal elections of around 95%. That's a massive turnout if you compare that to other countries that have no system of mandatory voting. So all in all, compulsory voting is basically the same thing as compulsory turnout. Electors need to go to the polling station and they need to cast a vote. But this whole system does have its implications. One of them is the increase in the possibility of invalid and informal votes being cast in the ballot box. Some people do not want to participate in an election, and because of that, and since they are compelled to vote, they'll just put another vote that is not valid in the box. There have been some discussions already about the validity, the lawfulness of casting invalid votes in an election. I'll leave links to some cases related to it in the description of this video. The other consequence is that you have to find some exceptions for compulsory voting. That is, allowing people not to vote depending on their justification. And the Australian law does provide that by asking you to give a valid and sufficient reason for not voting. According to section 245(5)(b) of the Commonwealth Electoral Act, it is an offence to fail to vote at an election without a valid and sufficient reason for the failure. Now, what are valid and sufficient reasons? Aha! That's the catch. The Commonwealth Electoral Act does not provide an exhaustive list of what are these reasons that can be considered valid and sufficient. But some of the legislation of the states, they do have a list, and so they are helpful to help us understand what are the valid and sufficient reasons for not voting. New South Wales, Tasmania and South Australia are the three states that give us some extended guidelines on what are these valid and sufficient reasons not to vote. In the New South Wales Act, for example, section 259(9) says that if you're absent from your state, that consists of a valid reason. If you're unable to vote because of sickness, it also counts. And even if someone has an honest belief that abstaining from voting is part of his or her religious belief, that person will be excused. So the justifications can be many, but the point is that an elector has to justify not voting. And since there's no exhaustive list of justifiable reasons, it's up for the Australian Electoral Commission to provide whether you have given a valid and sufficient reason for not voting. Of course, this has raised issues. In some cases even went to the High Court of Australia. The first one to get that was Judd and McKeon from 1926. In that case, the High Court really struggled to consider what are some examples of valid and sufficient reasons not to vote. But I'll be honest with you, I've written my LLM dissertation in this topic, and so I'll contain myself here, and I promise that I'll record another video just to talk about Judd and McKeon. So make sure you are subscribed to our channel and that you've hit the bell icon, because then you will know when I upload that video as well. And if you want to have access to our exclusive members area, you can also join us by becoming a member of AUSSIE Law. Now, do you know what happens if you fail to vote or if you fail to provide valid and sufficient reasons for not voting? Yes, that's right. You will pay for it. Literally. If you did not vote, you will receive a letter from the Australian Electoral Commission giving you basically two options. You either justify not voting, or you pay a fine of $20. I know it's not much, but it's still something. So, my friends, as you know, the best option is always to follow the law. So remember, even if voting is compulsory here in Australia, take joy in participating in the democratic process. In the upcoming federal elections, go to the local polling station, cast a valid vote, and then participate in the party of democracy, and why not have some democracy sausage? As for me, I hope to see you again soon. Until then, ciao.